So Claire is someone that has worked with data in the New Zealand sense for a very long time and has huge experience in this area. She was responsible for working with the dietary supplement data from the latest adult survey and has worked extensively with data from the children's nutrition survey. So Claire, I understand that your interest is some of the creative ways to use data in a practical sense and how we can get the best use out of the data we have. So can I ask you to take the floor once you're all sorted out?
So Tracy stole my pictorial view there. We've got the pebble over here, and we all know that was originated in New Zealand. So as Jenny alluded to, I am looking at some of the data mainly from the adult nutrition survey in terms of our food intakes. But just to put it in terms of a bit of a menu, I'm just going to give you a little brief introduction to 24-hour recall. We've actually talked about it quite a lot this morning, so we don't need to go into that too much. Then for an entree, we're going to talk about chicken stir fries or roast beef. In the main, I'd briefly like to discuss healthy and sustainable diets in light of the new Lancet report that's just come out. Then we'll go on to fish and chips. We're actually going to be very full by this point. And if I have time, I'll talk about total cholesterol, and then if you're still here, we'll stay for the after-dinner drinks. I just want to say, feel free, it has been quite a while that we've all been sitting here, so feel free if you do want to have a stretch or move around. I've been to a couple of physical activity conferences lately, and they're really good at doing that type of thing, so just to keep you guys awake. University of Otago employees, we're actually supposed to be on a stop work meeting right now, so if you feel like a coffee, I won't be distracted. But anyway, my involvement in the National Nutrition Surveys have gone back actually right to the 1997 survey where I did my MSc on dietary supplement use in New Zealand. So just a correction with Jenny, I wasn't really involved in the dietary supplement use in the adult nutrition survey in 2008. So this is my first introduction to survey data. And little did I know that dietary supplements were the wild west of dietary assessment at the time. And we did have quite a high intake of dietary supplements in that survey, with around, I think it was 30% reported using a dietary supplement in the previous 24 hours. And then I was fortunate enough to go on and work on the Children's Nutrition Survey as a research assistant, and I was involved in all things to do with the 24-hour recall in terms of preparing the tool we used for use with the interviewers, training interviewers, checking the diets and data quality, and then linking the foods that we used to the food composition database. So a similar job to that Liz Fleming undertook in the 2008-2009 nutrition survey. It actually requires a huge attention to detail. In the 2008 and 2009 Adult Nutrition Survey, I had gone away then and worked overseas for a while and came back after doing my PhD and had the joy of actually coming back to a complete data set. And so I was able to ask some research questions that I was interested in terms of changes in food intake between the 1997 surveys and the 2008 surveys, and also some of the questions around where we were sourcing our food in terms of fast food and restaurant type of food. And I also enjoyed working with other people in the department who were looking at different research questions as well and inputting into some of their research. And so I have developed a bit of a fascination with understanding what people eat and how they are getting their food and why they're eating what they're eating. And so when I look at this picture of Garfield and his daily food intake, lots of questions spring to mind. Was that lasagna vegetarian or meat? Did he eat it at all? Did he cook it himself, and does he know the recipe? Did he actually have that whole birthday cake? What type of fruit was on that cake? He had what looks like a bowl of cat food. Did that have any added vitamin and minerals? And did the coffee have sugar or milk added? Okay, so when we're interested in, that's basically some of the steps that we go through when we're collecting a 24-hour diet recall And so it is actually quite complex in terms of the questions that we ask people and the amount of detail that we're able to get from people in terms of what they've eaten. And so the 24-hour diet recall program that was used across the 1997 nutrition survey up till the 2008-09 was based, as Winsome alluded to, an automated system which used computer prompts, very similar to that of the American USDA automated system. Okay, so it follows a structure. It takes out the error involved in researchers coming up with their own questions because it's all computer prompted. So it really reduces the error. And little did I know when I was working on the CNS as a naive research assistant that really I was working within a system which was captured the data right from the start, and we also edited within the software, and we made our nutrient matches within the software as well. So it meant that all of those decisions could actually be tracked with great quality control. And so, as you know, there are quite a few steps involved in getting to the point of evaluating someone's dietary adequacy. Today I'm really mainly going to be talking about food intake, but I did want to point out that we are, as well as food composition databases, we also need to have really good measurement aids for measuring the amounts of food that people eat. We need information on density because quite often we have to measure things in mils when we're working with a participant, not necessarily grams. And so some of the data that I'm going to talk about today is from the food groups and sources of food in the Adult Nutrition Survey. And so just looking at the huge variety of foods that are in that database, there's 11,800 food descriptions, unique food descriptions. And all of these get coded into a food group, ending at the bottom there with the main food group here, breakfast cereals. Okay, so I'm talking really about that main food group level, but it is quite complex to get to that point. And of course, if you've got the microdata, you could actually take those food descriptions and come up with your food group system that you want to, if you wanted to do that. But it is quite time consuming. Okay, so the first question, how has our food choices changed between the 97 survey and the 2008? And because a similar system was used to collect the data between the two surveys and a similar coding method for those food groups, this is quite this is a good data set to work with for looking at that. And so there were many factors in that 10-year period that could have contributed to the dietary habits of our population, including technological changes, urbanisation, trade agreements, and closer trade agreements with Australia in particular. So we did have a wider range of food available and increased travel and influence of international influences. And so this is just graphically showing the percent of energy from the different food groups that we've looked at in the study. And this is for males. The bigger the word, the higher the contribution of energy. So if you want to look up the exact numbers, you can have a look at the paper. But just looking at alcohol there, that's around 5.7% of total energy. Bread, a huge contributor there with 11%. Potatoes around 5.5%. And sweetened beverages around 3%. And so when we compare males to females, you can clearly see that alcohol intake in males is a lot higher. Intake from bread-based dishes, so that's your burgers, your sandwiches, and your pizza, is a lot higher. Pies and sugar and confectionery. Sweetened beverages, sausages, and pies. And here we have the same graph for females, and you can see that the prominence of fruit there is a bit more there for females, with around 6% of total energy coming from fruit. And compared to males, there's a higher intake of energy from fruit, biscuits, soup, dairy, and dairy. So this graph is actually looking at how the contribution of selected food groups has changed between the two surveys. And this is as a percentage of total energy. I have looked at this as the percent of people that reported consuming each of these foods, and also as a gram amount, okay? So I've looked at it in all different ways, and the trends still hold, okay? So I'm just showing you this as a percent of total energy on this graph. And what we can see is that there is an increase in the percent of energy from rice. For males, an increase in the percent of energy from bread-based dishes and pasta dishes, and also an increase in the percent of energy for males for poultry, and a trend for females for that to be increasing. In terms of milk, the percent of energy from milk over this 10-year period declined, and cakes, beef, and this is also the same for lamb, butter, bread and potatoes. And so some quite marked changes in the way that we are eating in New Zealand, even just over that 10-year period. So the food choices did differ by sex and age, but trends were in the same direction over that period for the sex and age groups. There was a decrease in butter, cakes and puddings in line with dietary guidelines, but a move away from traditional New Zealand foods such as beef, potatoes and bread. And so it would be great to be able to, we have got some recent trends, and I've just pulled these out of the top of my head, but I'm sure that you can think of others that have been kind of more prominent recently, and it would be really interesting to see how some of these more recent changes have impacted on both our food and nutrient intakes in New Zealand. So just moving on to this question of a healthy and sustainable diet, and I thought it would be interesting to put the Adult Nutrition Survey data against the reference diet which has been proposed by the Planetary Guidelines, and that's recently come out in the Lancet, so we can see where we're at in terms of those quite aspirational targets. And so I haven't put in an estimate there for whole grain because it would have required too much of recoding of the data. So I'm sorry, we'll have to skip that one. But when we look at potatoes, you can see that, and this is grams per day for an adult male between 31 to 50 years for the Adult Nutrition Survey. And the reference diet that they quote in the publication is for a 70 kilogram man who's having an average kilojoule intake of around 10,500 grams. And in brackets is a range which they put there for the different age groups, starting from 2 to older people, okay? And so you can see there that for vegetables, our intake of vegetables is about half of those that reference intake, and for fruit around 134 grams. And then for dairy, we're pretty good. We're not too bad on that one. When we look at beef and lamb, you can see we're a lot over in terms of our population gram intake of beef and lamb, over for pork, approximately double for chicken, and fish we're approximately double. And looking at the dry beans and lentils and peas, we probably have quite a negligible intake of these in New Zealand, but we do consume baked beans, so I've put that in as 11 grams there. And similarly for soy food, in the 2008 survey, very little, but around 4 grams of tofu. And then good news, well, maybe it's good news, but good news for the nut researchers in the room. You've got a lot to do in terms of increasing our nut intake from approximately 6 grams per day at a population level to 50 grams, but noting that that estimate of 6 grams does include nut butters. So I'm not sure if the reference diet includes that. So I hope that's given you a little bit of food for thought about where we were at in 2008. It would be interesting to see where we were at now in terms of looking at that reference. So the next research question that I was interested in when I was looking at the ANS data was examining where we were obtaining our food or where we were sourcing it. And at the time there was quite a bit of focus on more socially economic deprived areas of New Zealand having a high exposure to fast food outlets in particular in their environment. So I was really interested in what that was looking like in terms of intake data and whether this was actually the case when we looked at intake. And so what I found, and I'll give you a little bit of an idea here. So just go back a few steps. In the Adult Nutrition Survey, for every food that was that people reported in that first quick list stage, they were also asked where they sourced it from, okay? And this included fast food and takeaways or restaurants, okay? But when we look at the New Zealand population, we can see that less than 10% on that very far end of energy was coming from fast food and takeaways. When we compare this to the US, it is actually quite a bit less than the US, and this is using a similar scope in terms of definition. And so New Zealanders 19 to 50 years, around 10.8% total energy from fast food and 4.2% from restaurant food. And a lot lower there in the New Zealanders 51 years and above, and it's the same in the US in terms of those age differences. When we're looking at, and I'm just going to concentrate on fast food here, who consumes fast food? So approximately 28% of the population reported consuming a fast food in the previous 24 hours, and 14% reported consuming a food from a restaurant. And when we take into account the people who only had beverages and didn't have any food, that reduced from 26%. That reduced to 26% for fast food. And interestingly, on Fridays, 44% reported consuming a fast food, okay? So that's that's something we need to take into account when we're doing the dietary surveys. And so looking at it by age, you can clearly see quite a difference there in terms of the 19 to 30-year-old age group were much more likely to report consuming fast food compared to the other age groups. When we looked at it by level of deprivation, we actually didn't show an increase in the people in the most deprived areas reporting fast food, and in fact it was in the opposite direction. But when you look at comparing the urban versus the rural, people living in urban areas versus rural areas, they were about half as likely to report fast food. So this is just looking at the fast food choices from the 2008 data, comparing 19 to 30-year-olds to 71-year-olds. And so you can see that 48% of those reporting fast food in the 19 to 30-year-olds reported a bread-based dish. Now these won't add to 100 because people choose more than one food. So you can see 48% compared to a much lower 30% for those in the 71-year-olds. And so when we look at the very far end for battered fish, you can see that our traditional battered fish and chips was a lot more common in that older age group. And so combined, nearly 40% of participants reported a fast food or cafe restaurant food in the previous day. It was higher in young adults, and so whether or not this is to do with a lifestyle at the time, at the age that they're at, or if that's something that they continue to do as they get older, is an interesting question. Not necessarily those, and it wasn't necessarily those of a low SES. And I think that this data demonstrates that there is a clear need for cheap and fast options for time-poor families. And I think that this has really been shown by the success of Nadia Lim and her My Food Bag. I mean, you still have to cook the food, but it does take the planning and the shopping element out of the equation. However, this type of option isn't affordable to everyone. So it would be good if we could have some greater incorporation of vegetables into some of our more convenience options, and as Lisa alluded to yesterday in her talk on whole grain, to start to think about ways we can make it easier for people to make those healthy choices that aren't too far away from what they're normally eating. And so, of course, it's not just about food intakes, and there are lots of different components to national nutrition surveys, including dietary habits and food security. And there has been some great examples of research in the Human Nutrition Department where people have combined different aspects of the survey to better understand diet. And one example is one that Winston mentioned earlier in terms of looking at trends in total cholesterol in the New Zealand diet. And I wasn't the mastermind behind this, but I did contribute to some of the analysis on looking at the food groups. And so here you can see the difference in serum cholesterol between 1989 and 2009. So the top part of the graph is the LINS 89 and the 1997 survey. And then below that you can see the 2009 survey. And then that steeper decline there in the older age groups can largely be attributed to the availability and increased prescription of statins. But what we were interested in is looking at explaining why the younger age groups also showed a similar decrease in terms of their total cholesterol. And so we also looked at fat intake, and so Winston talked about that earlier in terms of the percent of saturated fat, and this is for men 15 to 54 years, declining from 89 to ANS. And when we looked at the sources of the saturated fat in the diet, we mainly found that the decline was coming from dairy fat. So that was quite an interesting, and it shows a good example of combining both the clinical and the dietary measures in the data in this survey. So I couldn't do this talk without actually mentioning food security rates, because Jenny, Winston and myself all do have an interest in this area. And so you can see the 1997 results in terms of the percent who were food secure was 72%, those with low food security, and so that these are people who are reliant on others to provide the food that they need quite frequently, and are living in that kind of constant state of stress around food security. And you can see that it has increased between 1997 and 2008, and you can also see that higher prevalence there in the Children's Nutrition Survey, reflecting the fact that families with children are more likely to experience food security. And so hats off to the New Zealand, the Ministry of Health, who have measured food security in the New Zealand Health Survey in 2015. So it will be interesting to see those results, and they're pending. And I think it would be really great if we can continue to monitor this. The New Zealand government has recently changed with new efforts and policies around child poverty. And so I think that the measurement of food security would provide real-world data on the effectiveness of these new initiatives and have a direct relevance to health and wellbeing. So I think Tracy's talked quite a bit about total diet surveys, and I'm, again, not an expert of this, but I was involved in generating simulated diets, which went into the most recent total diet survey in New Zealand. And it was quite difficult to come up with these simulated diets using older data, particularly for the children, which was from 2002. So I think I'm probably talking to the converted here, but specific data on what we eat is really important, and it has been well argued by the previous two speakers. And I think it's also important that we do understand the influences of contextual factors such as social, cultural, psychological, built environments and food systems, and the home environment, so that we can actually make effective changes and understand the key levers of where these occur. And so as people interested in dietary assessment, I think we're at an exciting time. We're emerged in a lot of technology these days, and so there is some exciting opportunities to utilise this in the way that we collect data. And I'm not saying that these types of methods are appropriate for a population, because we do have to actually juggle respondent burden, researcher burden and cost. But I think that they can help in terms of triangulating our results, make us more aware of the limitations of both traditional and new methods. And so I'd just like to end on this last slide, just summarising some of the different applications of the National Nutrition Survey in terms of assessing nutritional status, guiding public health policy, informing food and nutrition guidelines, risk assessment and monitoring trends. And they say it takes a village to raise a child. I think it also takes a village to do a nutrition survey. And so I have listed some of the people that were, some of the organisations involved in the adult nutrition survey, but I know that there was a lot more people involved in the other surveys as well. If you look at the adult nutrition survey report, you'll see 3 pages of acknowledgements. So a huge team and a huge input from the whole community. And also a big shout out to New Zealand and our participants who let people into their homes to gather this data.
Thank you very much, Claire. And we've got time for a couple of questions for either Claire or Tracy. So the last 2 presentations. Stuart.
Two things to add to Tracy's very comprehensive lecture on Australia. One is that there was a national nutrition survey done in Australia in the Second World War around about 1942, headed by Fred Clements. And the nutrition department, the nutrition section of the Department of Health was then based in the Institute of Anatomy in Canberra. I don't know why in that building. But anyway, that was, I think, the first major nutrition survey done in Australia. The second point is, think about this. The food that people eat in Australia, much the same in New Zealand, is all exotic. There were people, humans, living and surviving in Australia for 60,000 years on what you could produce in the continent of Australia. But all the food, except the fish that people eat now in Australia, is imported. It's exotic. When the first fleet and the second fleet came in to Sydney, they were bringing with them, as well as the poor half-starved prisoners, they were bringing animals and plant seeds. So it's interesting that you did mention Aboriginal bush foods. There is a book edited by my colleague Jenny Brown-Miller on Aboriginal bush foods, about 250 foods in that. The analyses are not complete. There's a lot of more details about vitamins and minor nutrients, but there is something available. It's not online, it's in a book published by the Institute of Australian Studies.
I think something that I didn't mention is that my understanding, and people can correct me if I'm wrong, but in New Zealand we do produce a lot of fruit and vegetables, and so I think it is really important, and we consume a lot of the fruit and vegetables we produce. So we do import a lot of more exotic fruit and tropical fruit, but we're in a unique position where, for example, our potatoes we mainly source from New Zealand, and so it is really important to have that food composition data that's relevant to New Zealand. Yeah.
And just to add to the comment about the bush foods, and certainly when we were doing the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Nutrition Survey for the first time, finding the composition data for things like dugongs and other things that people were eating up there was a challenge. And I remember we had a composition program on kangaroo tail, so we had to try and find shops or places to source kangaroo tail and then go out and purchase them and send them off for analysis. And yeah, so it's a challenge to get that information, but of course we were able to use what little data was available at the time to put those data sets together.